Here in this video lecture, we're going to look at how deontology, Kant's deontology, can be applied to business ethics and an overall theory of capitalism. We'll be looking at Norman Bowie's article, A Kantian Theory of Capitalism. So let's first look at the categorical imperative and its first formulation. So, of course, the categorical imperative is the supreme principle of morality for Kant. The first formulation says, act only on that maxim by which you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. So, of course, what this means is you want to decide with an act you're going to do or about to do, right? So maybe I'm thinking about telling a lie to someone. Now, I would want to think, okay, what if everyone else were to also tell a lie? Would I be able to tell a lie in the first place? So you want to see if everyone were to also do this, so it would become a universal law, right? That everyone would will to do the same thing as you. Would it actually be possible? If it wouldn't be possible, the action would be logically contradictory and therefore immoral. If it would still be possible, then it would be morally permissible. So again, back to lying. Perhaps I'm thinking about telling a friend a lie. Now, I would want to ask, what if everyone else were to also lie? Would I be able to lie in the first place? Well, if everyone else were to also lie, then no one would trust anyone else because they would always think, well, this person's just lying, so I'm not going to believe what they're saying. So what you need is for there to be consistent cases of people being honest and not lying. That's the only way someone can lie. So if you were to lie and everyone else were to also lie, then again, no one would believe you in the first place, so you wouldn't be able to lie in the first place. So lying is therefore immoral. So let's say I'm going to hire an employee, right? Let's look at this from the standpoint of contracts here in this case. Now let's say I'm going to, of course, pay the employee, we'll say $20 an hour, okay? But I really, when it comes time to the paycheck, I only pay them $15 an hour. And they say, hey, like, we made an agreement, we shook hands or, whatever. I signed this thing and you said you will pay me $20 an hour, but you only ended up paying me $15 an hour, right? You lied. Well, of course, in applying the categorical imperative, we would know that the action the business owner took in not paying their employee, their worker, what they agreed to pay them, this would be immoral, and they would be breaking their contract. So we can already look at this in the case of businesses where deontology promotes then adhering to contracts and being honest in the formation of contracts. Now, what this also means, of course, is that, perhaps employees shouldn't steal because stealing is universally, if willed universally, it's contradictory. So therefore, according to the categorical imperative, it's immoral. That means workers, shouldn't steal from the workplace. It means bosses shouldn't steal, perhaps like wages, for example, from their workers and denying them, the full pay or the full value of their labor, perhaps. And there are other things as well, maybe like businesses shouldn't go and like try to steal secrets from other businesses, their competitors, and so on, because it's stealing in general is deemed immoral by the categorical imperative. There also shouldn't be free riding in business. So where perhaps maybe a business takes advantage of some kind of like loophole in a tax scheme or something like that, or where maybe an employee doesn't really like write down all the hours. Or let's say an employee kind of fudged some of the hours they spent on break and wrote down that they were on break for less time than they actually were, so they end up, getting paid during their break time, and perhaps they're not supposed to get paid during their lunch break, right? These are different things that we can apply the categorical imperative to in business settings, and we could learn, hey, like this is immoral. These workers or these bosses, these businesses shouldn't do these things. So let's look at the second formulation of the categorical imperative. This is known as the principle of humanity. Here, Kant says, we can understand the categorical imperative whereby we should act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. So in this way, we are supposed to treat others with respect, right? Treat them as dignified beings. Why? Why should I treat other human beings with dignity and respect, such that I never use them merely as a means to my own end, right? So I take advantage of them, but I always treat them as an end in themselves. The reason for this is due to Kant's argument for the rationality of human beings. So his argument goes like this. The first premise is that someone is a moral agent if and only if they are free and have the ability to make laws. What he means by that is someone is a moral agent if they are able to think about their actions from a universal perspective and potentially then legislate, right? That it is logical for me to have this will, to do this act. Premise 2. Someone is rational if and only if then she is free and has the ability to make laws. So if one is free where they're not influenced by external factors, then they are a rational agent. So if one is a moral agent, then one is and if one is a rational agent, then one is also a moral agent as well. That means because any human being has the capability to use reason to think, hey, in this action I'm about to do where I'm going to lie to my fellow coworker and I'm going to say, hey, the boss told me that we're supposed to clean up this area over here, but that's actually not true. The boss didn't say that, and I'm not going to take part in cleaning it. So then I kind of lie and getting the other coworker to do some more work so I don't have to do it. I would be taking advantage of that person, treating them as if they were not a human being. I would be using them as a mere means to my own satisfaction without taking into account themselves as a human being and their ability to think rationally, right? I'm treating them as a child or an animal or, a machine, right? Something that does not have, or something that is not a moral agent or a rational being. Now, some of the business implications then of this second formulation of the categorical imperative is, first, we can look at the buying and selling of goods in the marketplace. Well, if I'm going to, let's say, sell this mug here, okay? I make a bunch of these mugs and I want to sell these mugs in the workplace. Am I not treating my customers as a mere means? I'm taking advantage of them because I'm selling this to make money, right? Doesn't this seem to violate the categorical imperative? The answer is no. That as long as people consent to give me money in return for this mug, then even though I am profiting from this transaction, I am not treating them as a mere means to an end because they are consenting. So I am treating them as an end in themselves by only selling if they can, taking their money if they consent to it. And they are doing the exact same thing. So buying and selling goods of a marketplace passes then Kant's test here, and it is moral in those conditions where people consent to buy and sell goods in the marketplace. Now, what this also means is that workers have a right to meaningful work. They have a right to meaningful work because if one wants to try to hire someone to do some degrading, work and they don't pay them well, they would be taking advantage of them. They would be treating them again as an animal or a robot and not not valuing them as a human being. So this means, according to Kant, when we apply his categorical imperative in the workplace, there is a responsibility of employers to provide employees with meaningful work because it is human beings that desire self-fulfillment. If I don't allow human beings to engage in self-fulfillment and I employ them with degrading means of work, then I'm taking advantage of them. Another implication of the categorical imperative here in business is that it argues against the disparity in wages, right? We know there is a gendered gap in wages whereby for the same work, more often men are paid somewhat more than women. Well, we would know that according to Kant's categorical imperative, that would be taking advantage of women and denying them then their dignity as a human being. So what then bosses would be doing in those circumstances would be immoral. So overall, right, what we can see here is then, at least, in terms of the treatment of customers and employees by the owners of businesses, they have a moral responsibility to treat their customers and employees as humans and not just as mere capital, to squeeze profit out of. So here he says, the requirement to equal proportional marginal productivity works as follows. So in accounting and in finance, right, this is what is argued. If the price of machines rises with respect to labor, you substitute labor for machines because you save money and are able to maintain or increase your profit. But if the price of labor rises with respect to machines, then of course you end up automating, so you end up laying people off work, automating those jobs, using machines to replace them to maintain your profit or increase it. Both substitutions then are equivalent for one another because in this case, human beings are treated as mere capital like machines. But if we apply Kant's categorical imperative, it would say that the two substitutions are not morally equivalent. The first case is morally permissible. It is okay to substitute labor for machines if the cost of buying and maintaining machines rises with respect to the cost of employing labor. However, the second case is not morally permissible. It is not morally permissible to substitute machines for labor if the price of labor rises in comparison to machines, unless it be shown that in that substitution, the employees are not used as means merely, right? So there has to be a specific, contextual case where even though maybe employees are being substituted for machines, perhaps they're being employed then in another sector, right? So you're not firing them, you're replacing their job with a machine, but you're maybe giving them another job, right? That might be a case where you're not using your employees as a mere means to an end, which would be the increase of profit. Additionally, right, overall, we know that businesses must provide employees with meaningful work. Here's the extended argument for why that is the case. So if a corporation is to be considered moral, then corporate employees must be treated as ends and not as a means merely, right? We already know this based on just a general understanding of the second formulation of the categorical imperative. The second premise, though, is that if a corporation is to treat corporate employees as ends, right, so as not to violate the first premise, then the self-respect of the employees must be honored. Okay, that follows logically. It's an implication of premise 1. Premise 3 then says, to honor the employee's self-respect, so how then do you do premise 2? Employees must have a certain amount of independence as well as the ability to satisfy a certain amount of their own desires. So premise 4, if people must have a certain amount of independence as well as some amount of satisfaction of desires, then they must have a certain amount of wealth. So if then to honor employees, to treat them as human beings, they have to be given a certain amount, or you have to satisfy their desires, right, to a certain extent. Well, to do so is to ensure they, are paid adequately in wages for the work they do, so that way they can use that money to satisfy their desires. Then, premise 5, if this wealth is not to be handed to them, then, so if you can't then end up paying them sufficiently to meet all their desires, then an alternative could be to provide work in and of itself which those employees find meaningful. So those are your two options. That means, conclusion, Jobs must be available that provide pay sufficient to provide a certain amount of independence and some amount of satisfaction of desires, right? This is what businesses must do if they are not to violate the categorical imperative. Now, finally, let's look at the third formulation of the categorical imperative, the kingdom of ends. So the kingdom of ends says, act according to maxims of a universally legislating member of a merely possible kingdom of ends. So it does not actually matter whether or not people will end up acting in this way. One should act in this way regardless, as if we are all seeking to serve ourselves as one community, as a whole. Now, some of the business implications of this are that a business then should be organized as a moral community. It should be organized in the interest of every member of that community, right? Similar to arguments for why a commons should be enclosed. Now, what this means, again, is if we want to apply this to the stakeholder theory of the corporation, every single stakeholder should be treated exactly the same, that they have inherent value due to the fact that they are a member of the kingdom of ends. And it means that the only time one group of stakeholders could be privileged over another is if it is contextually justified. Like if, for example, maybe one group of employees puts in more time and work as compared to another. Well, you could end up paying that group of employees perhaps more than another without treating, of course, the other person as a mere means to an end, or without treating that other group as a mere means to an end. And in a way then, which still keeps the entire community organized in a moral way, where of course it's possible for those other members that are paid less to eventually work harder and maybe get paid more, or maybe contribute more to more money to shareholders if they end up investing more, right? Those are certain ways in which you can benefit one member of the moral business community over another, but only, right, if it is justified. Otherwise, they all have equal weight inherently. So in treating a business as a kingdom of ends, as a kind of moral community, there are some principles then that that should be demonstrated in a firm if it is going to be considered moral. The first is that the firm should consider the interests of all the affected stakeholders in any decision it makes, right? It should never think, hey, I'm only going to take into consideration the profit made from shareholders if I outsource and ship jobs overseas. Well, that's obviously going to impact the employees. So you would want to take into consideration, hey, how are the employees going to be affected by this decision? And in that case, right, am I going to treat them as a mere means? Second principle, that consideration of, the first principle should involve getting input from all the affected stakeholders. So there should be a way in which all the members of this community can voice their opinions, and they can be treated as human beings who are capable of dialogue, who are capable of thinking and contributing then to the value of the company. Principle 3, it should not be the case that for all decisions, the interests of one stakeholder take priority. So again, we've already seen then that means each stakeholder in the organization is inherently valuable and they have equal weight compared to everyone else. Finally, each business firm must establish procedures that are designed to ensure that relations among the shareholders are governed by rules of justice. You can't have, arbitrary decisions where the boss decides to have one group of employees work on Saturday just because they felt like it, right? So you need certain rules of justice then that are developed in accordance with the principles of 1 through 3, right? Where you take into account, hey, would it be okay? Would my employees like it if, they must be subject to work on any random Saturday because I feel like it, right? Maybe I should go and ask them about that, right? I should consult them on that decision. So there's ways in which then in using Kant's categorical imperative, you can establish, a kind of business justice, so to speak. Finally, from a wider perspective, then, the categorical imperative informs the way in which business transactions and then capitalism in general really contributes to a kind of cosmopolitan perspective. There are 4 reasons for this. So one is that capitalism is cosmopolitan in its outlook. The argument is that international commerce provides a means of linking the nations of the world together peacefully and democratically. It does so because, as the saying goes, where goods and services cross borders, tanks and guns do not. So it's in the interest, it's argued, for of course, for businesses not to promote war because war is costly. It ends up cutting into profit. Now, I think one thing to consider about this is whether or not we can entirely say this is true. And I think we can look at China and the example of capitalism in China where, it's not a democratic system, and yet it's actually the most successful capitalist system in the world, right? There's never been economic growth in any country in the world in history like there has been in the anti-democratic Chinese capitalist system. So is this first argument for capitalism true, right? Something to think about. The second thing, right? What about relativism, right? If business then promotes a cosmopolitan perspective because it promotes trade with all peoples of the world, well, what about the fact that there are different cultures all over the world, right? So when in Rome, right, perhaps when we're doing business in Rome, should we do as the Romans do, right? So then does capitalism promote relativism? And specifically then does a Kantian capitalism promote relativism? The answer is no. That different cultures can interact together in a Kantian framework. Only if, though, that practice that they adopt, right, of the customs of that other country do not violate the categorical imperative. If then, those business practices don't violate the categorical imperative, then of course, a whole variety of business practices are morally acceptable, right? So that means a Kantian conception of capitalism is amenable to differences among populations and how they might do business. The third argument here, that basic rights, like property rights, must act as a foundational framework. If this is not the case, then you can't have perhaps, honest negotiations in business. You can't be sure that if you have a factory, in another country, that those workers aren't taken advantage of over there due to, maybe non-existent labor rights, right? The reason, the main reason we can think about this is the principle of universalizability. We want to ask, hey, is it okay to engage in, certain kinds of business in certain areas of the world that do not respect property rights, right? Would this be acceptable? Well, you want to ask, well, if property rights did not exist over there, or if they didn't exist everywhere, would I be able to engage in business transactions in the first place? And of course, the likely answer is no, which is why property rights exist. So therefore, it wouldn't be morally permissible to engage in certain contexts with business transactions where things like property rights, for example, are not guaranteed. And I mean, the same thing could be true of other kinds of, like, let's say, human rights, right? Where it wouldn't be okay to engage in contexts in business transactions where perhaps, the people you want to do business with own slaves, right? That would be immoral. Finally, it's an Enlightenment contention that a cosmopolitan world is supported by international commerce. The reason, again, is that where goods flow, then armies don't. Again, though, I think we should ask the question, what about protectionist wars? What about the fact that, let's say like 1953 Iran, So in 1953, Iran had a democratically elected leader, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Mohammad Mossadegh did not like the fact that British oil company was, taking advantage of Iranian resources and benefits weren't flowing to the Iranian people. So that Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh said, "Hey, we're going to nationalize this industry here because the Iranian people are being taken advantage of. They're not getting any benefits from the fact that oil is here in Iran, and yet all the profit, or almost all of them, are going to the United Kingdom, right? And specifically, a small number of people, right? The owners of the British Petroleum Company." So he threatened to nationalize that Iranian oil industry, or oil in Iran, I should say, and turn it into the Iranian oil industry. And what did the United States and the British government do? They instituted a coup. They overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, and of course they reinstalled the Shah, or the King of Iran. Eventually, of course, this leads to the 1979 Islamic Revolution and the overthrowing of the king, the dictator, the Shah. So, that's just one example of where we can see actually for business interests, right? It was in the interest of business to have the United States government and the British government overthrow that democratically elected prime minister in Iran, right? We have some cases where, well, actually, to protect markets, businesses will actually support war. So perhaps, we might want to think whether or not this Enlightenment contention is entirely true. And even maybe if it's not entirely true, perhaps there's still some merit, even if, the consequences aren't always the case, but because it's good in and of itself to promote these kinds of business relations. Of course, as long as they don't treat people as mere means, right? I mean, we know if we applied the Kantian categorical imperative that overthrowing the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953 was using the Iranian people as a mere means to the end, which was the continuation of huge profits by that British petroleum company, right? So we know that action would be considered immoral, right? So some things to consider here.